The air smelled wrong. That was the first thing. Not the silence. Silence had its own texture, its own weight, but the smell, chemical, thin. Like the atmosphere itself had been quietly replaced while he wasn't paying attention. Captain Ren Casper came back to himself the way a man surfaces from very deep water. Slowly then all at once. His fingers found the cold floor before his eyes opened. Concrete, he catalogued that. Concrete was real. Concrete meant earth. He pressed his palm flat against it and held on. He'd been dreaming again. The same dream. His sister's kitchen in Gdańsk, the smell of Zurich on the stove. Afternoon light cutting yellow through net curtains. Her voice calling from another room. Something about the radio. Something about the news. He'd never heard the end of it. He hadn't been home in 4 years when it happened. And he hadn't been back since. Ren sat up. He was in the operations cabin of Survey Station 11. A repurposed drilling platform on the eastern slope of what used to be the Caucasus Range. See, the monitors were dark. The generator was cycling on its reserve feed. He could tell by the particular frequency of the hum, a half-step flat from normal. Everything else was off. He'd been asleep for, he checked his wrist unit, 11 hours. That wasn't possible. He'd set a 3-hour rest cycle before the system check. Someone, or something, had overridden it. He moved to the window. The light outside was the gray-violet of early morning, but the shadows fell wrong. The trees on the ridge, those stubborn Caucasian pines that had survived the die-off, survived the gas dispersal, survived everything, were bending away from the valley. Not wind. There was no wind. They were bending as if the air on the valley side was simply heavier, pressing outward like water behind a dam. Ren had been a geologist for the Emergency Serve Corps before the Corps stopped existing. He understood pressure differentials. He understood atmospheric gradients. He understood that what he was looking at could not be explained by any of those things. He pulled on his mask, checked the seal, and went outside. The valley floor had changed color overnight, not all of it. A corridor maybe 200 meters wide, running north to south, threading between the ruins of what had been a resort town and a collapsed transmission tower. The ground there was the color of old pewter, and it didn't reflect light the way rock did. It absorbed it. Where the morning sun should have picked up glints and angles, there was only a flat, consuming gray that made Ren's eyes water when he looked at it directly. He'd seen preliminary reports about this, zones of altered substrate. The Xeno survey teams had started calling it drift, and nobody higher up had corrected the term because nobody higher up had a better one. The drift moved. Not fast. You couldn't watch it move, but between measurements, between visits, it spread. Always in corridors. Always following something he hadn't been able to identify. He pulled out his field recorder and started talking. Old habit from the survey days, before the equipment got good enough to log everything automatically. The act of narrating steadied him. Casper Ren, day 411, station 11, new drift corridor, bearing roughly 010, approximately 200-meter width. Leading edge is, he checked his rangefinder, 93 meters from the station perimeter fence, 40 meters closer than yesterday's reading. He stopped. Something's was standing at the far edge of the drift zone. He'd seen them 3 times before, always at distance, always at dawn or dusk. Those transitional hours, when the light was ambiguous enough that part of his brain kept insisting there was a simpler explanation. Scheming, they were tall, taller than any human proportion should allow. The body a long column of deep, oil-slicked black that caught color without reflecting it, ringed lower down with what looked like folded limbs, but moved like nothing that had evolved under gravity. When they moved, they didn't walk. They translated. The space between where they were and where they arrived next was simply removed. He was not supposed to be in contact with a forward element without backup and a full comms relay. He was aware of that regulation, and he was currently alone on a station with a dead communications array, watching one of them stand at the edge of the converted Earth and look at him. He did not run. He'd learned, in 411 days, that running attracted response. That stillness was at least neutral. It tilted its upper section toward him. Not a head, there was no head, but some forward orientation, some focusing of attention. Feel it. The way you could some Feel a searchlight sweeping toward you before the beam actually hit. Then it spoke. The sound wasn't in the air. It was in his chest, below language, below frequency, a pulse of meaning that he'd learned, slowly and terribly, to partially interpret. This one was an instruction he'd heard before, delivered, the last several times, to ground and soil and stone. Today it was aimed at him. Move aside. Ren Kaspar, last of the Eastern Survey Corps, ex-was geologist, holder of absolutely no authority over anything at all, stood at the fence of his little station on a dead planet and said, out loud, through his filter mask into empty air, no. The occupation had begun, as far as anyone could reconstruct, about 16 months before the pandemic. Shh. That was the part they hadn't understood until later. The pandemic hadn't been an accident of zoonotic spillover or laboratory error. It had been prep work, something introduced into the biosphere with surgical patience, something that waited until it had saturated the water table and the soil microbiome and the bodies of 3 billion carrier animals before it activated. By the time it did, there was nothing to prepare against. No lead time, no warning signal. Just, suddenly, a world that was dying at a rate the hospitals couldn't process, couldn't slow, couldn't name. The ships came in the second month of the die-off, when communications infrastructure was already failing, and the surviving governments were entirely occupied with the immediate catastrophe. They didn't make themselves visible. They simply settled, here and there, in high remote places, mountain ranges, polar plateaus, and began doing whatever it was they did. The drift started around the same time. The correlation was noticed. Nothing was done about it, because there was no functional military left, and no consensus on what doing something would even mean. Ren had been on a survey contract in the Black Sea Basin when his city stopped answering. He'd driven back as far as the roads allowed, and then walked, and he'd understood, somewhere in the first day, of walking through the particular quality of silence that had replaced everything, that he was not going back to find his sister. He was going back to find her absence, which was a different task entirely, and one that required a different kind of preparation. He'd spent 6 months in Gdansk anyway, going through things, sitting in her kitchen, eventually eating the Zurich she'd left in the freezer, because it seemed important to not waste it. He'd found her handwriting on a notepad by the phone. Grocery list, partially completed, interrupted mid-item, and he'd torn the page out and folded it into his jacket pocket, and he still had it. Then he'd come back out east, because east was where the drift was, and the drift was the only question left worth answering. He wasn't alone in this. There were others, scattered, uncommunicado for long stretches, connected by short-range relay when geography allowed. He'd met 41 of them over the previous year. He remembered each one clearly. 37 were still alive as of his last contact. What they'd learned, collectively, in bits and pieces that had to be carried physically between sites because the signal infrastructure was gone. The drift was preparation. The gray pewter substance was a primer, a biological and chemical reset that stripped the soil of its existing microbial ecology and replaced it with something that could support an entirely different kind of life. When enough of it spread, and the modeling suggested a threshold of somewhere between 60 and 75% of surface area, the environment would cross a point of no return. The atmosphere would begin to shift. The water chemistry would change. The planet would become, over the following decades, something that could sustain them, and would kill anything human that remained. They were patient. They had the patience of something that thought in geological time. Humans had was 11 survivors worth of geological survey data, a handful of repurposed sensors, and Ren Kaspar telling one of them, through a breathing mask, no. It looked at him for a long time. He counted, because counting helped. 12 seconds, 20, 38. Then it moved. Toward him, sideways, along the drift edge, and then gone, translated somewhere he couldn't see. The heavy air in the valley didn't shift. The trees kept bending. He went back inside and spent 3 hours trying to understand what had just happened, why it had listened, why it had left. He'd known them before, in small ways, blocking a sensor placement, disrupting a drift expansion point he'd identified, once throwing a bucket of his own wastewater on a section of newly converted substrate. because he'd read in one of the relay messages that biological contamination seemed to cause localized dieback. The last one had worked. He had photos. The dieback had spread 12 meters in each direction from the contamination point before stopping. And when he'd measured the affected section a week later, it had partially reconverted to standard soil chemistry. They'd never directly addressed him before. He pulled up the relay and started encoding a message, short range only. But there was a repeater station 3 ridges over that could bounce it further if someone had maintained it. He didn't know if anyone had. He sent it anyway. "They're talking to me." One of them faced me directly and used imperative command language. I said no. It left. "I need to know if this has happened to anyone else." He set the message cycling and went to make tea. The water was rain collected and the tea was about 18 months past, its best before date, but it was warm and it was something he'd chosen for himself, which felt important in a way he didn't try to articulate. The relay chimed 4 hours later. He'd been asleep, this time voluntarily, in the chair. He read the message. It was from Petra, the hydrologist, 70 kilometers north. She'd been watching a drift expansion point for 6 weeks. 2 days ago, she'd poured a solution of concentrated lactic acid bacteria, basic yogurt starter culture. She had a lot of it, into the leading edge. Drift had stopped, not slowed, stopped. Below her message was a shorter one from Desmond, the ex-marine biologist, relayed from somewhere in what had been northern Turkey. His message was 3 words. "They spoke to me too." Ren spent the following week not sleeping enough and thinking about his sister's grocery list. Eggs, rye bread, lemons, and then the pen stroke that indicated interrupted thought. The list cut off mid-item somewhere between lemons and whatever came next. He thought about the Orcs she'd been making, which was a soup built on fermented rye flour, and the specific kind of patience required to ferment anything, the willingness to introduce living cultures, and wait and trust that the chemistry would do what chemistry did. He thought about the drift dieback, 12 meters. Biological contamination. Not weapons, not anything purpose-built, just the ordinary biological products of a human body, introduced into something that had no framework for managing them. He thought about the long, folded, oil-slick creature that had told him to move aside, and then when he didn't, had simply left. They thought in geological time. They had planned this for years before the first human body showed a symptom. They had the patience of something that had never, in its entire evolutionary history, encountered an adversary that simply refused to go. They could be bothered, that was the word he kept returning to. Not beaten, not repelled, bothered. The dieback had bothered them. His no had bothered them. Not enough to act, but enough to notice. Enough that one of them had stopped its work to come look at him. He encoded a longer message this time. He sent it to everyone on the network, all 27, or however many were still receiving. He laid out the chemistry. He laid out the timeline. He laid out what he thought the threshold meant and what would happen when they hit it. Then he laid out what he wanted to try. It wasn't a plan that would win. It wasn't a plan that would stop them. He was honest about that. Because he'd been a scientist before everything else, and the data was what the data was. The drift would reach threshold eventually. The atmosphere would change eventually. This was a planet being slowly digested. And there were 27, maybe fewer, humans left who could do anything about it. Slow was the operative word. Slow meant time. And time meant, maybe, that the thing they couldn't compute, the thing they'd never had to account for, the sheer unreasonable human habit of being present and refusing, and making yogurt, and fermenting rye flour, and throwing buckets of biological waste at carefully prepared terrain. Maybe that bought enough time for something else. He didn't know what the something else was. He said so in the message. He said, "I don't know what this leads to. I know that we are bothering them, and I think we should keep doing it. I know that one of them came to tell me to move, and I said no, and it left. And that is the most interesting thing I have observed in 411 days." He hit send. He made more tea. He sat with his sister's grocery list in his hand, reading the familiar angles of her handwriting, the interrupted stroke of her pen. Outside, the trees on the ridge bent away from the valley. The drift held its steady geological pace. He pulled on his mask. He picked up the container of biological solution he'd been preparing for 3 days. A dense, living culture of every soil bacterium he'd managed to cultivate from the unconverted ground around the station. He walked out into the morning. The creature was there again at the edge of the drift corridor. It oriented toward him the way it had before. He could feel the searchlight sensation of its attention, settling on him with a weight that was almost physical. Move aside. The valley was very still. The gray pewter surface absorbed the pale sun. The trees bent. Casper crouched at the drift edge and opened the container and pressed it directly into the border between the converted and unconverted substrate, working it into the soil with his gloved hands, distributing it evenly the way his sister had showed him to work pastry dough. A long time ago, in a kitchen in Gdańsk, that smelled of warm flour and winter light, he said without looking up, "No." Behind him, on the relay, the first responses were starting to come in. Desmond. Others whose names he'd memorized because memorizing them felt necessary. Each one a single word or a short phrase, encoded in the shorthand they'd developed over months of sparse contact. Confirmed. Still here the creature did not move. Ren did not move. The dieback, slow and invisible and very much alive, began to spread. He thought about patience. About the particular human version of it, not the patience of geological time, not the patience of something that could simply wait out any opposition, but the other kind, the kind that fermented bread and kept grocery lists and heated frozen soup because it belonged to someone who mattered. The kind that was fundamentally, stubbornly, unreasonably aimed at a future it had no guarantee of reaching. The sun climbed. The shadow of the transmission tower stretched long across the gray. Ren kept working,